on this Sunday morning, July 31st. Where did the month go? Like, that's the end of the month. Although I kept thinking that today was the 1st of August as well. So, but this is our Sunday morning brief. This is my opportunity as pastor of Sunrise Church to offer you a little bit more about the sermon or the message today, or the scriptures that we use in worship. Just a chance to say maybe things that I don't have time to say in the sermon, and or just things I want to share. Make sure that we really hone in on, and that's really what today is. Is I'll talk a little bit about God's grace today, and I think we just can't hear it enough about this very nature of God, that is love and grace. This morning we're going to hear our first reading for today has to do with generosity, and how God's generosity flows through us to others. And that's from 2 Corinthians. And then we continue the sermon series this summer, and like summer activities. So we're talking about harvest. And so the gospel reading is from the Gospel of John. And I love what our passage is. It's from John 4, but it talks about this harvest, talks about how Jesus is talking to the disciples, kind of telling them, you are going to harvest what someone else has planted. You are going to be the recipients of this produce that somebody else has done the work on. And of course, that somebody is God. That everything that we have received is from God, and everything that we encounter, every person we encounter, every situation we encounter, God has already been at work, tilling the land, planting the seeds, providing nourishment, for the growth of that person or that situation. And then as we are part of relationships, part of an experience, like, we then get to harvest that. We get to see the blessings from that. But not only that, is that we also then can do some of that work with God on planting and nourishing, so that someone else is going to experience the harvest. All right, so that's kind of the overall message, but I wanted to just hone in again on this idea of God's grace, and just how significant and how often we should be thinking about God's grace for us. That God's grace is above and beyond anything that God would give to us. So even when we think about God who might judge us for our actions, that remember that how God views us is always from a stance of grace. Grace abounds. Grace is a gift, and it is the most, it never runs out, right? So I want to just help us sit in that knowledge of God's grace today. That if there is nothing, if we think of nothing else about God, right? If we were to, and this will sound heretical, but if we just forgot about even like scriptures, if we forgot about some of the doctrine or teachings of the church, like if all we was God's grace, that would be more than enough to make our lives full, to help us be the kind of people that we are made to be, would bring harmony and peace to the world. If our only knowledge of God is about God's grace, then we have arrived. Now, there is so much more for us to know, and I think that's why God has given us scriptures. I think that's why we have doctrine, because there is a fullness of that grace that we want to encounter, and we do that in so many ways, in thinking about different aspects of our faith and studying the scriptures. So don't hear me that I'm saying that we should get rid of all of that. I'm just saying that if we do all of the other works of our faith, the worship, the study of scripture, everything. We do that because of God's grace, because we have been loved so fully by God that God pours grace over us again and again and again. When we here at Wesley at Sunrise Church talk about grace, we do so in the way that John Wesley taught about grace, which is that God's grace moves in three different ways. So we have God's grace that is around us when we aren't even knowing it, like when we don't think about it, when we don't acknowledge it, when we don't receive it. Like God's grace is already there. That's prevenient grace. And then justifying grace is when we figure out, hey, God is in my life. God is wooing me. God is wanting me to be God's child, to know the fullness of being God's child. Then we call that justifying grace, or John Wesley calls that justifying grace. We've been justified, like we are accepted and worthy of God's love and God's grace. And then the sanctifying grace of God that moves in us, that enables us to grow, to change, to be transformed, to enter into the life of the church and with others. This grace of God just never ends for us. And it is all we truly need. And so I just would love for us today, everyone who either hears this message or however the Spirit brings the word to people today, is to really sit in God's grace. Like that is really all we need. Because when we know God's grace for us, we can extend God's grace to others as well. And it truly will change the world. So I look forward to seeing you in church, whether today or another day. I hope that the rest of your day is the very best of your day. And just know that God's grace is pouring over you, and may you be blessed. So we'll see you in church, 10 a.m. Sunday mornings, in person, and here on Facebook and YouTube.